So in our last mini lecture, we had left off discussing the change the 12th Amendment brought about to the election of presidents. And now we kind of want to move away a bit from talking and thinking about the history of the president and start talking about presidential power. And this is a really big topic in American politics and in political science, because there's a big question about how and where presidents get powers. And this has actually been a huge campaign issue in the last several elections. It often is, but in some ways it's probably taken on new heights in the contemporary era. And the question is about how and where do presidents get power? Now, if you're just thinking about this conceptually, political scientists basically have two views, and they're both graphed here for you. One possibility when you're thinking about the presidency is to say, okay, presidents, the first view takes a look at presidential power this way. Now, this isn't perfect. This is just kind of a way of conceptualizing it. Imagine if we could graph presidential power. In other words, if we could have some kind of power scale, that comes from 0 to some, infinite point of power. And then here along our y-axis, we are tracing time. And what these two kind of views would be, if we trace them, the first one would say, look, slowly but surely, presidential power has increased, right? So that no one particular presidency did anything nutty, maybe even came down a little bit at points. But the general trend over time has been that presidents have gotten more and more powerful, thus that when you look at the difference between today and the very first presidency, there's a huge power differential. Now, the second view says that presidents had a relatively even amount of power, and then there's this huge jump, there's a bump, and then they have relatively even amounts of power. We call this second view the modern presidency theory. And you might at this point be wondering, and rightfully so, what is it that marks this? And the answer for the modern presidency theorists, more or less, is FDR. In other words, it is that FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, fundamentally shifts the presidency, changes it, such that we can see one kind of presidency before he's in office and an entirely different kind of presidency after he's in office, and he then becomes the explanation for this shift, so it's not necessarily very gradual. So what is it then about FDR that makes him potentially such a unique and transformative president? And the answer is that really there are a number of things that scholars will look to that are unique to FDR that make him different from the presidents who came before him. The first is that he has a very active legislative agenda. Early presidents actually very much shied away from becoming involved in the legislative process. The idea being that Congress was supposed to decide, okay, what the laws are going to be, and the president's an enforcer. And FDR in many ways will be one to say, no, we need to have an agenda. We need to be getting things done and trying to push things specifically through Congress. The second is that under FDR, we will have some of the largest federal expansions of programs ever, and the biggest entitlement program to ever be conceived, which was Social Security, still around with us today, which fundamentally changes the size, the scope, and the nature of the bureaucracy, and thereby the presidency. The third is that in the wake of World War II, we will build and then have one of the world's largest superpowers. And this is a weird departure from history. As a matter of fact, early in American history, the idea of having a large standing army was one of government oppression. The idea that we shouldn't have big armies because big armies would oppress the local population. It would be too much power for government, and specifically the federal government. But this will be a shift, and the president, as the commander-in-chief, will end up benefiting from the superpower status of the United States in the wake of World War II. The fourth, and it's still with us, take a look at the end of any presidential campaign, this idea of what can happen in the first 100 days. Well, why the first 100 days? What's so important about the first few months of any particular presidency? And the answer is, well, that was when FDR is going to end up making many of his big legislative pushes. The final one, although it won't end up being successful, is court packing. Because it's going he's going to end up using a new strategy. Something you can think of as going public. And he's actually going to use a new technology to work on this. And for FDR, it's radio. FDR, many of his legislative agendas will get pushed back on by the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court will rule them unconstitutional, and we'll learn more in the next section about what that means for something to be ruled unconstitutional. But in short, the president's deals were ending up getting pushed back on by the Supreme Court. And so he wanted to radically change the size of the court so he could have his own appointees. It was a court packing plan. And he's going to turn to his fireside chat in order to do this. And he's going to appeal directly to the general population in a way that's never happened before, and that's because presidents before him didn't have a way to easily communicate with everybody all at once. This is going to happen through radio, and it comes with all different kinds of changes in the style of presentation, right? If you're out and you're trying to talk into a big room, or even when I'm lecturing to a large class, I talk very differently than I do when I'm recording these for you, right? When I'm recording these for you, it's like I'm having a conversation with you. I'm not yelling at you. But if I'm in a classroom, I project. I have to talk loudly. Right? and I apologize if I'm now coming through your speakers. But see, I can talk in a conversational level, and then you can change the volume to make whatever you want me to sound like to you. This is a new idea for radio, and so the president being able to be in your home with the fireside chat, the ability to go directly to the public, was new, and presidents still do it in different ways today, and we call this going public. So, who or what specifically is the president or the presidency? And there's a couple of different ways to look at this, and many of these are some pretty big views, and we're going to look at three big views of who or what presidential power, where it comes from, right? The first view is understanding the presidents and presidential power comes from personality. And James Barber is going to be the individual who kind of most pushes this. And when he says, okay, if you want to understand presidents and presidential power, we need to look at individual presidential psychology. And it's the individual psychological makeup that determines how successful or not successful presidents will be. Richard Neustadt, will argue that presidential power has to do with the ability to persuade, and persuade not just Congress and other people, but his own branch to get done the things he wants to do, so that presidential power is fundamentally about the ability to persuade others to do and to see things the way you want them to. And Howe, more recently, will argue that the presidency and the president is really about the institution. It's all of that bureaucracy that makes up what happens, both powerful and potentially limiting. And we're going to take a look and read about a number of these views as we move through the class. Now, what are the constitutional powers that presidents have? Well, there are three major types of constitutional powers that presidents have or claim. And these are expressed powers, delegated powers, and inherent or vested powers. And we'll take a look at each of these in turn. Express powers are the powers that are actually found in Article 2. You can go look and touch and breathe them. They're kind of like the powers found in Article 1, Section 8 for Congress. So the President has military power that comes from Article 2, Section 2. The President is the Commander-in-Chief, right? Quote, the President shall be the Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States and of the militia of the several states when called into the actual service of the United States. The President is going to also have a bunch of judicial power. One of the biggest ways, and this also comes from Article 2, Section 2, is the pardon power. Presidents have, quote, the power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment. So this ability to kind of intervene in the court process itself. The President's going to get a bunch of diplomatic powers in Article 2. In Article 2, Sections 2 and 3, the President has the appointment power for ambassadors and other public ministers and councils. They're going to have a treaty power, so the power to make treaties with foreign nations with the advice and consent of the Senate. The President is also going to have, not shockingly, executive power, which comes to us through Article 2, Section 3, to engage and enforce the laws of the land. And finally, the President, in two places in the Constitution, one in Article 1 and Section 7 and one in Article 2, Section 3, will get legislative power. And the big legislative power, we've already even looked at this, is the ability to veto bills. So he has a role in this. And as a matter of fact, this is a much bigger role than you might imagine. Congress, although it can, as we've seen, override with a 2/3 vote, as of 2009, a few years ago now, there have been 2,562 vetoes, and only 110 of them have been overturned. And for those of you who can't do that math in your head, that means only about 4% of them have been overturned. And this probably doesn't even completely express the the veto power, because we know from a bunch of literature that just threatening vetoes can have a huge impact on whether legislation makes it or not. So presidents can kill bills with a veto threat long before they actually even have to wield the veto pen. Delegated powers, or the second broad type of powers we're going to take a look at, come to the president from Congress. So it's Congress who is delegating these powers. And delegated powers are when there's legislation, broad legislation that's passed that more or less expands the presidency. So to give you kind of an idea, so instead of Congress saying, and this is just kind of an example, okay, look, everywhere in the United States, the following number, parts per million, will be the maximum amount of pollution in a given area. Generally, what Congress does is, we assume that you can range somewhere between nothing in the air to the air being completely full. Congress will say, look, we're going to set some parameters. And inside of these parameters, an agency is going to make a decision, in this case, potentially the Environmental Protection Agency. Okay, so EPA, on the basis of your expert work, figure out when and where the air quality needs to be what. And we call the EPA making these kinds of rules administrative law. And this is a chance for the presidency because all of these agencies are part of the institutional presidency. And this gives the presidency the opportunity to potentially reach down and without consulting Congress say, change this number. Right? So that's a delegated power. Now the final kind, vested and inherent, comes from a unique reading of Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution. Right here it says, quote, executive power shall be vested in the President of the United States of America. And that phrase has had a lot of push because presidents recently have, well, not just recently, but presidents generally, have come to read that phrase as giving them very broad powers, including creating executive branches and requiring departments to do specific kinds of things. And to give you an example, Abraham Lincoln will issue a series of executive orders without really any other clear legal authority other than emergency. He's going to call Congress without calling Congress into session. He's going to combine state militias into a national volunteer force. He's going to call for 40,000 new volunteers. He's going to enlarge the regular Army and Navy. He's going to divert $2 million in unspent appropriations to military purposes. He'll institute censorship of the U.S. mail, order a blockade of southern ports, suspend portions of the Constitution, including the writ of habeas corpus in border states, and order the arrest by military police he personally deemed guilty of engaging or contemplating treasonous activity. And so this is a huge expanse. It basically says, inherent or vested, says that the president has certain powers just by the nature of being a president. And the Supreme Court in the case Reed-Eagle will actually generally uphold this view. Now, it has never come to a complete Supreme Court battle, but this is the best that we have. And so presidents more or less have some inherent or vested powers. Well, we're going to pause here, and you can kind of see we've been moving and talking more and more about the Supreme Court. And in our next section, we're going to move over and start examining the Supreme Court process, and as I noted earlier, try to kind of understand things like how does the court strike down laws. So let's pause for now, and I'll listen to you in a minute.